Princess Diana, the People's Princess. The midnight hour. The city of lights glowed against the velvet darkness of that summer night. Paris breathed with the rhythm of late August, when tourists still crowded the sidewalk cafes and the Seine reflected 1,000 golden windows. It was the kind of evening that promised nothing but possibility, the kind that whispered of romance and adventure, of a world where tomorrow would dawn brighter than today. But in the heart of that shimmering city, beneath the elegant streets where lovers strolled and artists dreamed, a tunnel waited in silence. The Pont de l'Alma underpass stretched beneath the Paris streets like a concrete throat, its white tiles gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Cars passed through it every minute of every day, their drivers never thinking twice about the mundane passage from one side of the river to the other. It was just a tunnel, unremarkable and forgettable, one of thousands that honeycomb beneath the world's great cities. On the night of August 31st, 1997, that tunnel would become a tomb. Within its cold embrace, history would shatter like glass against concrete, and the 20th century would lose one of its most luminous figures. The woman the world knew as Princess Diana, the People's Princess, would take her final breath as dawn crept toward the French capital. She was 36 years old. But that ending, though it came too soon and too violently, was not the whole story. To understand the magnitude of that loss, to grasp why billions of people would weep for a woman most had never met, we must travel back through time. We must walk through the grand rooms of British estates and the narrow corridors of Buckingham Palace. We must stand beside a young girl waiting on a doorstep for a mother who would never return, and watch as that same girl transformed into the most photographed woman in the world. We must witness her smile for the cameras while her heart broke in private, see her reach out to touch the untouchable, and watch her wage a quiet revolution against an institution that viewed compassion as weakness. Forged is the story of Diana Frances Spencer, born into privilege but defined by pain, thrust into a fairy tale that became a nightmare, and ultimately transformed into something far more powerful than any crown could make her. This is the story of how a shy kindergarten teacher became a global icon, how a broken marriage became a catalyst for change, and how one woman's refusal to remain silent would shake the foundations of the British monarchy. The tunnel was just the ending. But the story begins decades earlier, in a house near the sea, where a little girl played in the shadow of queens and princes, never imagining the extraordinary and terrible destiny that awaited her. Born in the shadow of royalty. July 1st, 1961. On the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, England, where the Queen and her family gathered for holidays and hunting seasons, a baby's cry broke the afternoon stillness at Park House. The Spencer family, who leased the 10-bedroom Georgian mansion from Queen Elizabeth II herself, welcomed their fourth child into a world of inherited titles and ancient bloodlines. They named her Diana Frances Spencer, after her mother and a distant ancestor who had once been considered as a bride for royalty. But the joy in that house carried a sharp edge of disappointment. The Spencers had been hoping for a boy. 'Cause just 1 year before Diana's birth, Francis Spencer had given birth to a son named John. The family's hopes had soared with his arrival, the long-awaited male heir who would carry forward the Spencer name and legacy. But John had lived for only 10 hours, dying shortly after his birth on January 12, 1960. The tragedy had devastated both parents, but it had done something worse as well. It had created an expectation, a pressure that would poison the family from within. After John's death, Diana's father, Viscount Althorpe, and her mother, Frances Shand Kidd, had tried again for a son. When Diana arrived instead, another girl to join her older sisters Sarah and Jane, the disappointment was palpable. For an entire week, the baby remained unnamed, as if her parents couldn't quite accept what they had been given instead of what they desperately wanted. Diana would later say that this early rejection, though she couldn't possibly have remembered it consciously, had marked her from the beginning. But there was more at work than simple preference. The pressure on Francis Spencer to produce a male heir had been intense and humiliating. Diana's younger brother, Charles Spencer, would later reveal that their mother had been sent to Harley Street clinics in London, where doctors examined her like a breeding mare, trying to determine why she couldn't seem to produce healthy sons. The experience was degrading, a reduction of a woman to her reproductive function, and Charles Spencer believed it planted the seeds of his parents' eventual divorce. As he would later say, it was a dreadful time for his parents, and probably the root of their divorce because he didn't think they ever got over it. Yet despite this shadow over her arrival, Diana's early childhood held moments of genuine magic. Park House sat on 20 acres of the Sandringham estate, and young Diana Spencer grew up, quite literally, as the royal family's neighbour. Queen Elizabeth II was not some distant figure to be glimpsed in newsreels, but someone Diana called Aunt Lilibet, a friend of the family who lived just down the lane in the grand Sandringham house. Diana's childhood playmates were Princes Andrew and Edward, the youngest sons of the Queen, who were close to her in age. She played in the gardens where royalty walked. She attended Sunday services in the same church where the Queen worshipped. She was, from her earliest days, intimately familiar with the rhythms and rituals of royal life, though she existed just outside its golden circle. The Spencers were aristocracy, yes, with a lineage that stretched back centuries and connections to the royal family that ran deep. Diana's grandmothers had both served as ladies-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, but they were not royalty itself, not quite part of that highest tier, and perhaps that made the proximity both tantalizing and painful. Diana was a quiet child, described by those who knew her as sweet-natured and sensitive. Within her family, they called her Dutch, short for Duchess, a nickname that referenced her tendency to give orders to her older sisters and to carry herself with an air of dignity that seemed beyond her years. But beneath that Duchess-like composure lay a little girl who felt things deeply, who noticed when adults were unhappy, who absorbed the tensions in her household like a sponge soaking up water. Polishing, and there were tensions to absorb. Her parents' marriage, strained by the death of baby John and the humiliating medical examinations that followed, was deteriorating. Viscount Althorpe was described as a quiet man, constant in his love for his children, but increasingly distant from his wife. Francis Spencer, on the other hand, was someone Diana would later describe as not cut out for motherhood, a woman trapped in a life she hadn't chosen and desperate for escape. Stabilized was 6 years old when her childhood shattered like delicate crystal struck by a hammer. It was 1967, and England swung with the optimism of the era, but within Park House, storms were gathering. What Diana didn't yet understand was that her mother had fallen in love with another man, Peter Shand Kidd, a wealthy wallpaper heir who promised Francis an escape from her unhappy marriage and the crushing expectations of aristocratic life. Conquered, the separation, when it came, was swift and brutal. Diana would remember the sound of gravel crunching beneath car tires as her mother drove away, leaving her youngest children behind. She would recall waiting on the doorstep, day after day, for her mother to return as promised. But Francis Spencer didn't come back. What followed was a custody battle that would leave scars on Diana's soul that never fully healed, a betrayal that would shape every relationship she had for the rest of her life. The little girl who played with princes was about to learn that privilege could not protect her from abandonment, and that some wounds, no matter how gently they were bandaged, would never stop bleeding. A childhood fractured. Blankets. The divorce proceedings that followed were unlike anything British high society had seen in recent memory. Aristocratic marriages might be unhappy behind closed doors, but they were meant to maintain appearances in public, to preserve the family name above all else. Francis Spencer's decision to leave her husband for another man and her determination to take her children with her broke all the unspoken rules. Diana initially lived with her mother in London during the separation, but when Christmas 1967 arrived, Viscount Althorp refused to let his daughter return to London with Francis. It was the opening salvo in a bitter custody battle that would split the family down lines no one could have predicted. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. During the custody hearings, Francis's own mother, Ruth Fermoy, testified against her daughter. Lady Fermoy, who served as lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother and who valued social standing above nearly everything else, sided with Viscount Althorp in the custody dispute. She believed, or so she would later claim, that the children would be better served staying with their father, an earl and a man of substantial means and position. The testimony was an act of betrayal that would haunt both mother and daughter for the rest of their lives. The betrayal cut Francis to the bone, but the decision was made. Viscount Althorp won custody of all 4 Spencer children. Diana and her brother Charles, the youngest, remained at Park House with their father, while their older sisters were away at boarding school. Francis was granted visitation rights, but the relationship between mother and daughters would never be the same. Diana later described the period following her parents' divorce as deeply unhappy and unstable. She felt abandoned by her mother, even though she understood intellectually that Francis had wanted custody. The emotional reality for a 6-year-old was simpler and more painful. Francis had left, and she hadn't been strong enough or determined enough to take her children with her. Her brother Charles would later tell the Sunday Times that Diana used to wait on the doorstep for their mother, who had promised to come back, but never did. Pruning Diana's brother Charles, only 3 years old when the divorce was finalized, would later tell reporters that Diana had become like a mother figure to him during this period. With their actual mother gone and their father emotionally withdrawn in his own grief, Diana took on a role far too heavy for such young shoulders. She comforted Charles when he cried. She tried to explain things that she herself didn't understand. She became, at age 6, someone who took care of others even when she desperately needed care herself. Phosphate, the weekends when Francis was allowed to visit, were bittersweet. Diana would later recall how her mother would cry at the end of every Saturday visit, pleading not to let the children leave the next day. Emotional display, whether intentional or not, left Diana confused and torn. She loved her mother, but she also resented her for leaving, for not fighting harder, for crying but never quite managing to come back for good. In 1969, Frances married Peter Shand Kidd, the man for whom she had left her family. The marriage seemed to confirm what society whispered, that Diana's mother had been unfaithful, had chosen passion over duty, had abandoned her children for personal happiness. The judgment was harsh and gendered, as such judgments always are. Viscount Althorp's emotional distance and possible infidelities received far less scrutiny. Then, in 1975, when Diana was 14, her paternal grandfather died, and her father became the 8th Earl Spencer. With the title came a new home, Althorp House, the Spencer family seat in Northamptonshire. It was a vast estate, over 100,000 square feet with 90 rooms, far grander than Park House, but also far more formal and imposing. The move meant leaving behind the house where Diana had been born, where she had played with princes, where she had last felt truly at home. That same year, Viscount Althorp remarried. His new wife was Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, a forceful and ambitious woman whom Diana and her siblings took an instant dislike to. Diana would later call Rain a bully, and the relationship between stepmother and stepdaughter was poisonous from the start. On one occasion, Diana's resentment boiled over into violence. She pushed Rain down a flight of stairs at Althorp, an act that spoke to the rage simmering beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Viscount Althorp had kept his remarriage secret from his children, springing it on them as an accomplished fact. When Diana learned of the marriage, she confronted her father and, if she remembered correctly, slapped him across the face, saying words to the effect that it was from all of them for hurting them. The teenager who had seemed so sweet-natured and compliant had a core of anger that surprised even her. These were the years when Diana learned fundamental lessons about love and betrayal, about the ways families could splinter and the scars such fractures left behind. She learned that people you trusted could leave without warning. She learned that even grandmothers could betray you if their loyalty to social position outweighed their love. She learned that fathers could withdraw into cold silence, that stepmothers could be cruel, that mothers could weep, but never quite manage to rescue you. Diana would carry these lessons into her marriage, into motherhood, into every relationship she tried to build. She would spend her life both seeking the unconditional love she'd been denied as a child and expecting, on some level, that everyone she loved would eventually abandon her. It was a wound that shaped her compassion for others who suffered, but it was also an ache that never stopped hurting, an emptiness no amount of public adoration could ever quite fill. By the time she left school and moved to London in her late teens, working as a kindergarten teacher's assistant and sharing a flat with friends, Diana Spencer had developed the ability to present a cheerful face to the world while hiding oceans of pain beneath. She was kind, she was funny, she was good with children. She seemed, to those who knew her casually, remarkably well-adjusted. But she was also deeply vulnerable, hungry for love, and desperate to believe in fairy tales. When Prince Charles, heir to the British throne and the most eligible bachelor in the world, began to show interest in her, Diana allowed herself to hope that this time, finally, someone would choose her and never leave. She had no idea she was walking into a trap far more cruel than anything her childhood had prepared her for. The fairy tale begins. Firefight. November 1977. Diana Spencer was 16 years old when she first met Prince Charles at Althorpe House. He had come for a weekend pheasant shoot, but his real interest was in Diana's older sister, Sarah. Lady Sarah Spencer was beautiful, confident, and exactly the kind of aristocratic young woman who seemed suited to life as a princess. She and Charles dated briefly, moving in the same social circles, attending the same parties and hunts that defined upper-class British life. Diana watched from the sidelines, a shy teenager in jeans and a checked shirt, hardly the sort of girl a prince would notice. During that first meeting, Charles would later recall thinking what a jolly and amusing 16-year-old she was. But there was no spark, no suggestion that this awkward adolescent would one day become his wife. Diana herself would describe their first meeting as happening in a ploughed field, an unglamorous beginning to what the world would soon see as a fairy tale romance. This relationship between Charles and Sarah fizzled quickly. Sarah would later tell a reporter, with characteristic bluntness, that she wouldn't marry Charles if he were the dustman or the King of England. She seemed to understand instinctively what Diana would learn too late, that marriage to Charles meant marriage to an institution, to duty and protocol and endless sacrifice, and Sarah Spencer wanted no part of it. Meliors, so years passed. Diana saw Charles occasionally at social events, always from a distance. She attended his 30th birthday celebration at Buckingham Palace in November 1978, one guest among hundreds. There was nothing to suggest that Charles, who was under increasing pressure from his family to marry and produce an heir, had given her a second thought. But in the summer of 1980, everything changed. Diana was 19 years old, working as a kindergarten teacher's assistant in London and sharing an apartment with friends. Charles was 31, still unmarried, and facing mounting pressure from his father, Prince Philip, to settle down. The press had linked him romantically with various women over the years, but none had proven suitable or willing to accept the crushing demands of royal life. When Diana and Charles crossed paths at a country house weekend in July 1980, Charles saw her with new eyes. She had grown up, shed her teenage awkwardness, become a beautiful young woman with a natural warmth that drew people to her. More importantly, She possessed qualities that Charles's family valued highly. She was aristocratic, with impeccable breeding and connections to the royal family. She was young and seemingly malleable, likely to defer to her husband and accept guidance from the institution. And crucially, she had no romantic history that could be exploited by the press. Diana Spencer was, in the crude calculations of royal marriage, a virgin, unsullied by previous relationships. Charles invited Diana to join him aboard the royal yacht, Britannia, for a sailing weekend in Cowes. The invitation was followed by another, this time to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where Diana would meet Charles's family. She passed what insiders called the Balmoral test with flying colours. The Queen liked her. Prince Philip approved. The Queen Mother found her delightful. Diana seemed happy tramping over sodden moors in the rain, seemed content to participate in the shooting parties and formal dinners that defined royal life in Scotland. What Diana didn't know was that Charles was still deeply in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman he had wanted to marry years earlier, but who had been deemed unsuitable because she wasn't a virgin and lacked the aristocratic pedigree the royal family demanded. Camilla had married someone else, but she and Charles had maintained their friendship, a friendship that would, in time, reignite into something far more. The courtship was brief, almost shockingly so. By Diana's own later account, she and Charles had met only 13 times before he proposed. 13 dates, 13 occasions to assess whether they were compatible, whether they loved each other, whether they could build a life together. For a marriage that was supposed to last forever, that was supposed to produce the future monarch of the United Kingdom, 13 meetings seemed almost criminally inadequate. But Charles felt trapped. His father had written him a letter that made the situation clear. Either Charles should propose to Diana or he should let her go, stop stringing her along while he made up his mind. According to royal biographer Robert Jobson, Charles told a friend at the time that to have withdrawn from the relationship would have been cataclysmic. He felt boxed in by duty, by expectation, by the knowledge that at 32 he needed to marry soon. It was clear from these circumstances that Charles and Diana had never truly dated in any conventional sense, and this lack of genuine courtship would prove to be a significant handicap to their relationship. On February 3, 1981, Charles proposed to Diana in the nursery at Windsor Castle. It should have been romantic, but it was oddly businesslike. Charles suggested that Diana take the holiday she had planned for the following week and use the time to consider her answer. Diana accepted immediately, her heart full of hope and fairy tale dreams, but Charles's suggestion of a waiting period should have been a warning sign. They engagement half weeks while Diana adjusted to what her new life would mean. She moved temporarily into Clarence House, the Queen Mother's residence, and then to Buckingham Palace, where she waited for her wedding day. Biographer Ingrid Seward would later describe Diana's time there as incredibly lonely. She was isolated from her friends, cut off from her normal life, and thrust into a world where every moment was scheduled, every appearance scrutinized, every word she spoke subject to approval. Regatta February 24, 1981. Diana appeared beside Charles in a cobalt blue suit, wearing an enormous sapphire and diamond engagement ring that she had selected herself from the crown jeweller's Garrard. The ring was stunning, a 12-carat oval Ceylon sapphire surrounded by 14 solitaire diamonds set in 18-carat white gold. But the televised engagement interview that followed was a disaster, though most people wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. When the interviewer asked if they were in love, Diana responded immediately and naturally with an emphatic affirmative. Charles's response would haunt them both for years. He added, with a small, uncomfortable laugh, that it depended on whatever being in love meant. Diana's face in that moment, if you watch the footage carefully, shows a flicker of hurt and confusion. She tried to smile, tried to brush past the comment, but it had landed like a stone in her stomach. Years later, on the secret tapes she recorded for biographer Andrew Morton, Diana would say that the comment threw her completely and absolutely traumatized her. It was a strange answer that revealed far more than Charles perhaps intended. But she pushed the doubt away. She was 19 years old, about to marry a prince, about to become the most famous woman in the world. She wanted to believe in the fairy tale, needed to believe that Charles loved her, that everything would be wonderful once they were married. Parliamentary, the warning signs that multiplied as the wedding approached. There was the matter of a bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla Parker Bowles, a gold chain with intertwined letters. Some sources claim these stood for their nicknames for each other, while others suggest different meanings. Diana discovered the bracelet just days before the wedding and was devastated. She wanted to call off the wedding, but her sisters talked her out of it. Everyone had been invited. The dress had been made. It was too late to back out now. Then there was the night before the wedding, when Diana overheard a telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla. She listened as her future husband spoke to another woman with a tenderness and intimacy he had never shown her. The conversation left her deeply disturbed and questioning the marriage even as it was about to begin. Astrologer Penny Thornton, Charles had actually told Diana the night before the wedding that he didn't love her. He had wanted, in some misguided attempt at honesty, to clear the air before they made their vows. The confession, Thornton later said in a documentary, was devastating for Diana. But on the morning of July 29, 1981, Diana Spencer climbed into the glass coach that would take her to St. Paul's Cathedral, wearing a dress with a 25-foot train, and smiled for the cameras. She was about to become Princess Diana, and 750 million people around the world were watching. The fairy tale was about to begin. But for Diana, it was already turning into a nightmare. The wedding of the century. Childbirth. The morning of July 29, 1981, dawned bright and clear over London. The city had transformed overnight into something from a storybook. Streets lined with cheering crowds, Union Jacks fluttering from every lamppost, the air electric with anticipation. This was the wedding that would define an era, the marriage that would, people hoped, revitalize the British monarchy and give the nation a reason to celebrate after years of economic hardship and social unrest. Unemployment was climbing to devastating levels. Riots had torn through major British cities just weeks earlier. Britain needed something to believe in, some reminder that magic still existed in the world. And the wedding of Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer promised exactly that. It was a distraction, perhaps, but it was also a moment of collective joy, a chance for millions to participate in something beautiful and hopeful. Blind's Diana woke that morning in Clarence House, where she had spent the night before her wedding. She had barely slept, her mind racing with doubts and fears and the overwhelming reality of what she was about to do. Her wedding dress hung nearby, an extraordinary creation of ivory silk taffeta designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel. The dress was a masterpiece of 1980s romance, with puffy sleeves, a fitted bodice embroidered with thousands of pearls and sequins, and that famous 25-foot train that would require careful handling as Diana walked down the aisle. But the dress that had fit perfectly at her first fitting no longer fit quite right. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Diana had lost a concerning amount of weight. Her waist, which had measured 29 inches at the first fitting, had shrunk to 23.5 inches. The dramatic weight loss was the result of the eating disorder that had begun with a cruel, offhand comment from Charles during their engagement photo shoot. He had remarked that she was getting a bit chubby, and those words had burrowed into Diana's mind like parasites, feeding her growing sense of inadequacy and lack of control. The bulimia that would plague Diana for much of her marriage had begun even before she became a princess. The night before her wedding, while the world waited excitedly for the ceremony, Diana was in her room, caught in the cycle of binging and purging that gave her an illusion of control over a life that felt increasingly out of her hands. The royal family and their friends found it quite amusing that Diana could eat so much and never gain weight. They didn't understand, or chose not to see, that something was desperately wrong. The journey from Clarence House to St. Paul's Cathedral took Diana through streets packed with cheering crowds. More than 600,000 people had lined the route, hoping to catch a glimpse of the young bride. They waved flags, threw flowers, shouted their congratulations. Diana waved back, smiling, playing her part perfectly, even as her heart pounded with anxiety. St. Paul's Cathedral had been chosen over Westminster Abbey because it could accommodate more guests, 3,500 people in total. The cathedral had been transformed for the occasion, filled with flowers and decorated with all the grandeur the British monarchy could muster. Representatives from royal families across Europe had travelled to witness the ceremony. First Lady Nancy Reagan represented the United States. Celebrities and dignitaries filled the pews. It was, by any measure, one of the most watched events in human history, with television coverage reaching 74 countries and an estimated 750 million viewers tuning in worldwide. As Diana's carriage arrived at the cathedral and she stepped out, adjusting her veil and preparing for the long walk down the aisle, the world held its breath. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale, young and beautiful and radiant. Her father, John Spencer, took her arm to walk her down the aisle. He had suffered a stroke some time before and struggled to make the walk, but he was determined to give his daughter away. Diana had said her father wished she was marrying an ordinary chap so she could live with her husband at Althorpe House, a wish that spoke to his understanding of what Diana was about to face. The ceremony itself was a traditional Church of England service, presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Diana was nervous, so nervous that she made a mistake during her vows, calling Charles by the wrong names in the wrong order. Instead of saying Charles, Philip, Arthur, George, she said Philip, Charles, Arthur, George. Charles, for his part, forgot to say he would share all his worldly goods with her. The mistakes were small, understandable given the pressure, but they would later be seen as symbolic of the troubled union. After they exchanged vows and rings, after the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, the couple walked back down the aisle together as the organ thundered through the cathedral. Diana was now Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales. At 20 years old, she was the youngest woman to marry an heir to the British throne in over 300 years. She was also, uniquely, the first British citizen to marry an heir in that same time span, and the first royal bride to have held a paying job before her engagement. The newlyweds travelled by carriage back to Buckingham Palace for the wedding breakfast, another procession through cheering crowds. When they appeared on the palace balcony, the crowd roared. Charles and Diana kissed, a brief, somewhat awkward kiss that satisfied the public's desire for romantic gesture, but lacked any real passion. They waved to the crowd, smiled for the cameras, and then retreated inside, where the private reality of their marriage could begin. Unrecognized, the wedding breakfast was a formal affair, filled with toasts and speeches and the weight of centuries of royal tradition. Diana smiled and nodded, said the right things, played the role she had been cast in. But already she was exhausted. Already the mask was starting to slip. For their honeymoon, Charles and Diana began with a stay at the Broadlands estate in Hampshire, followed by a Mediterranean cruise aboard the royal yacht Britannia, and finally a retreat to Balmoral Castle in Scotland. It should have been romantic, a chance for the couple to finally be alone together, to build the intimacy their rushed courtship had never allowed. But the honeymoon revealed the stark incompatibility between them. Charles brought books about philosophy and spirituality, subjects that interested him deeply. Diana had no interest in such things. She wanted to talk, to connect emotionally, to build a relationship with her new husband. Charles found her need for conversation exhausting. He retreated into his books, into his own thoughts, creating distance even as they shared close quarters. And then there was Camilla. During the honeymoon cruise, Diana discovered photographs of Camilla falling out of Charles's diary. She confronted him, and he became defensive, angry that she was jealous of what he insisted was merely a friendship. The photographs were a constant reminder that Charles's heart belonged to someone else, that Diana was second choice, a duty wife chosen to produce heirs rather than a partner chosen for love. Years later, she would talk about feeling utterly alone, despite being constantly surrounded by people. She would remember the feeling of knowing, with growing certainty, that she had made a terrible mistake, but having no way to escape it. The contract had been signed. The vows had been spoken in front of 750 million witnesses. There was no backing out now. When they returned from the honeymoon and took up residence at Kensington Palace, the real work of being royal began. Diana had to learn the protocols, the rituals, the endless rules about how to dress, how to speak, how to behave in every possible situation. She had to become comfortable being photographed constantly, having every outfit analyzed, every word she spoke reported in the press. She had to accept that her private life no longer existed, that she belonged to the institution and to the public before she belonged to herself. But Diana would prove far better at being royal than anyone expected. She had a natural warmth, a genuine ability to connect with people that couldn't be taught. When she visited hospitals, or opened buildings, or shook hands with crowds, people felt seen by her in a way they never had by any other royal. She had empathy, that rare quality of being able to truly feel what others felt, and it showed in every interaction. The press fell in love with her, the public adored her. Within months of the wedding, Diana mania had swept the nation, and then the world. She was the most photographed woman on the planet, more famous than any movie star, more beloved than any politician. Everything she wore became an instant trend. Every hairstyle was copied by millions. She had become, in the true sense of the word, an icon. But inside the palace walls, Diana was drowning. And the man she had married, the man who should have been her anchor and her support, had already turned his back on her and returned to the arms of the woman he truly loved. Behind palace walls. The pregnancy was announced on November 5, 1981, just months after the wedding. The nation rejoiced at the news that an heir would soon be born, another generation to secure the line of succession. But for Diana, the pregnancy brought no joy. It brought morning sickness so severe she could barely function, postpartum depression that the royal family had no framework to understand or support, and a desperate isolation that drove her to the edge of despair. It was during this pregnancy, when she was 3 months along with William, that Diana threw herself down the stairs at Sandringham. She would later describe it as a cry for help, an attempt to get Charles's attention, to make him understand how badly she was struggling. She told him she was feeling desperate, that she needed him, that something was deeply wrong. Charles's response was cold and dismissive. He told her she was crying wolf, that he had heard it all before. Then he went riding, leaving Diana lying at the bottom of the stairs, bruised and terrified. When he returned, he showed no concern for her or for the baby she carried. The message was clear. Her emotional needs were an inconvenience. Her pain was a burden he had no interest in carrying. Remarkably, miraculously, William was unharmed. Diana suffered some bruising, but the royal gynecologist confirmed that the baby was fine. It was the first of what Diana would later reveal were multiple suicide attempts, desperate acts by a woman who saw no other way to escape the cage she had walked into. Over the course of her marriage, Diana would cut her wrists with a razor, slash her chest and thighs with a knife, throw herself against a glass cabinet, and hurt herself with a lemon slicer. She was crying out for help in the only way she knew how, and no one was listening. On June 21, 1982, Diana gave birth to Prince William Arthur Philip Louis. The baby was healthy, beautiful, and instantly beloved by the press and public. Charles was initially delighted, though he would later express disappointment that William had red hair, and worried aloud about it. But for Diana, the birth triggered a crushing wave of postpartum depression. She had expected that becoming a mother would give her purpose, would fill the emptiness inside her. Instead, she felt overwhelmed, inadequate, convinced she was failing at the one job the royal family truly cared about. She cried constantly. She couldn't sleep. She felt disconnected from her baby, from her husband, from reality itself. When she tried to explain to the royal family what she was experiencing, they didn't understand. They had no frame of reference for postpartum depression. Queen Elizabeth had given birth 4 times without any such problems, or if she had struggled, she had never spoken of it. Diana's tears, her emotional volatility, her inability to simply soldier on as generations of royal women had before her, marked her as unstable in their eyes. This labeling, Diana would later say in her Panorama interview, gave everybody a wonderful new category for her. Diana was unstable. Diana was mentally unbalanced. And unfortunately, that label stuck. It became the explanation for everything, the reason her marriage was failing, the reason Charles turned to Camilla, the reason Diana couldn't seem to adapt to royal life. Her mental health struggles were used against her, proof that she was the problem rather than a symptom of the toxic environment she had been thrust into. Through all of this, the bulimia continued and worsened. Diana would later describe it as a secret disease, a manifestation of what was happening in her marriage. She explained that she had bulimia for a number of years, that it was a repetitive pattern which was very destructive. But she also made clear that it was a symptom, not the cause of her troubles. The royal family saw it differently. Everyone in the family knew about the bulimia, Diana would later reveal, and everyone blamed the bulimia for the failure of the marriage. But the marriage was failing for reasons that had nothing to do with Diana's eating disorder. It was failing because Charles had never loved her. It was failing because he had married her out of duty, while his heart belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles. It was failing because the institution cared more about appearances than about the emotional well-being of the people trapped within it. Charles and Camilla had resumed their affair by 1986, according to most accounts. Some claim it never truly ended, that they had maintained contact throughout Charles's courtship and early marriage to Diana. Whatever the precise timeline, by the mid-1980s, Charles was spending more and more time with Camilla, attending house parties where she was present, carrying on phone conversations that became increasingly intimate. Diana knew. She felt it in the way Charles looked at her, or rather didn't look at her. She heard it in the way he spoke to Camilla on the phone, with warmth and tenderness he never showed his wife. She saw it in the gifts he gave Camilla, the jewelry with special meanings, the attention he lavished on another woman while barely acknowledging the mother of his children. But when Diana tried to confront Charles, he became defensive and angry. He accused her of being paranoid, of being jealous without cause, of imagining things. The gaslighting was subtle but effective, making Diana question her own perceptions even as the evidence of Charles's betrayal mounted. On September 15, 1984, Diana gave birth to their second son, Prince Henry Charles Albert David, known as Harry. With the heir and the spare now secured, Diana had fulfilled her primary duty to the crown. She had produced 2 healthy sons who would ensure the line of succession. Everything after that was merely performance, playing her role in public while living in a marriage that had become a prison. Diana later confessed that falling down the stairs at Sandringham was not an accident, as had been reported, but a deliberate act. She said she had thrown herself down the stairs, that it was one of multiple attempts to hurt herself. She described the acts as her way of saying that she was rejected, that she didn't think she was good enough for the family, so she took it out on herself. She explained that she could have gone to alcohol, which would have been obvious, or become anorexic, which would have been even more obvious. But she decided to do the more discreet thing, which ultimately wasn't discreet, but was her way of hurting herself instead of hurting others. The royal family's response to Diana's pain was to ignore it, to minimize it, to wish it would simply go away. They couldn't comprehend that one of their own might need psychiatric help, that mental illness could touch even the golden family at the apex of British society. And so Diana suffered in silence, or as much silence as was possible for the most photographed woman in the world. But even in her darkest moments, even when she couldn't see any way forward, Diana was discovering something important about herself. She was discovering that she had a gift for connecting with people who suffered. When she visited hospitals, she was drawn to the patients others avoided, the ones with stigmatized illnesses, the ones who frightened people. She would sit on their beds, hold their hands, look them in the eyes, and really see them. It was the beginning of her transformation from a decorative princess into something far more powerful. It was the moment when Diana started to realize that while her marriage might be a failure, while the institution might never accept her, she had the power to make a real difference in the world. She had a platform that few people ever obtained, and she was going to use it. The palace might want her to simply smile and wave and look pretty, but Diana had other plans. She was going to touch the untouchable, speak for the voiceless, and in doing so, she was going to transform not just her own life, but the very nature of what it meant to be royal. Finding her voice. The year 1987 marked a turning point in Diana's life. 7 years into her marriage, drowning in an eating disorder and plagued by depression, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life and cement her legacy. She decided that if she couldn't fix her marriage, if she couldn't make the royal family accept her, then she would find purpose elsewhere. She would use her position to help people who suffered as she suffered, who felt marginalized and afraid and forgotten by society. In April 1987, Diana opened Britain's first dedicated AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital in London. It was a momentous occasion, but not because of the standard ribbon-cutting ceremony or royal speeches. What made it remarkable was a single photograph that would change the world's perception of HIV/AIDS forever. In the photograph, Diana is sitting beside an AIDS patient, her hand clasping his. She is not wearing gloves. Her skin touches his skin directly, with no barrier, no protection. She is leaning in close, smiling, treating him not as someone to be feared, but as someone deserving of compassion and human connection. The photograph made front-page news around the world. In the 1980s, fear and misinformation about HIV/AIDS were rampant. Many people believed the virus could be transmitted through casual contact, through touching or sharing space with someone who was infected. Hospitals sometimes isolated AIDS patients completely. Families abandoned their sick relatives. The infected faced not just a terminal illness, but also crushing social stigma and isolation. Diana knew these facts, and she deliberately chose to challenge them. By shaking hands with AIDS patients, by sitting on their beds and touching them without gloves, she sent a powerful message. She showed that people with HIV/AIDS were not dangerous, not contagious through simple human contact, not worthy of the fear and hatred directed at them. She demonstrated that they deserved dignity, compassion, and touch, all the things every human being needs. The impact was immediate and profound. At the National AIDS Trust, a spokesperson would later say that in their opinion, Diana was the foremost ambassador for AIDS awareness on the planet, and no one could fill her shoes in terms of the work she did. Nelson Mandela himself would praise her efforts, saying that when she sat on the beds of AIDS patients and held their hands, she transformed public attitudes and improved the life chances of such people. Diana continued this work for years. She visited AIDS hospices in London, in Brazil, in Canada. She held dying men's hands and listened to their stories. She hugged children who had been infected through blood transfusions. She spoke publicly about the disease, using her platform to educate and to advocate. The work was deeply personal to her, driven by her own experience of feeling isolated and stigmatized for things beyond her control. Not her only cause. In 1990, Diana became patron of the leprosy mission, an organization dedicated to treating and supporting people affected by leprosy. Like AIDS, leprosy carried tremendous stigma. Many people believed it was highly contagious, that touching someone with leprosy would inevitably lead to infection. The reality was quite different. Leprosy is not highly infectious, and a cure had been available since 1981. But myths and fear persisted, leaving those affected isolated and ostracized. Kang Diana traveled to India, Nepal, and Zimbabwe to visit leprosy clinics. She touched patients' bandaged wounds, shook hands with people society had labeled as untouchable, demonstrated through her actions that people with leprosy deserved neither fear nor pity, but rather compassion and care. She would later say that it had always been her concern to touch people with leprosy, trying to show in a simple action that they were not reviled, nor was she repulsed by them. In 1992, Diana became patron of Centrepoint, a charity providing housing and support for homeless young people in the United Kingdom. Homelessness was an issue close to her heart, perhaps because she understood, in her own way, what it meant to feel displaced and without a safe haven. She didn't just attend fundraising galas for Centrepoint. She visited the hostels where homeless youth stayed. She sat with them, listened to their stories, treated them as individuals rather than statistics. Diana brought her young sons, William and Harry, along on some of these visits. She wanted them to understand that privilege came with responsibility, that their position gave them not just power, but also a duty to serve those less fortunate. The images of Diana walking through homeless shelters with her sons, showing them that not everyone lived in palaces, became iconic. She was teaching them compassion through example, raising them to be different kinds of royals than those who had come before. The press and the public loved Diana's humanitarian work, but the royal family was less enthusiastic. They appreciated that she was good at her job, that she drew crowds and generated positive headlines, but they also felt she was overstepping, getting too involved, caring too much. Royals were meant to be distant, dignified, above the messy, emotional reality of the causes they supported. Diana's hands-on approach, her obvious emotional investment, her willingness to touch and hold and cry with the people she met, struck some within the palace as undignified. Charles, in particular, seemed to resent Diana's growing popularity. When they went on royal tours together, the crowds would chant for Diana, demanding to see her, expressing disappointment when Charles appeared instead. There were occasions when Diana was assigned to one side of the street and Charles to the other, and people on Charles's side would complain that they had gotten the wrong one. It was humiliating for Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing to be king, be upstaged by his young wife. The marriage, already troubled, deteriorated further under the strain of Diana's popularity. Charles withdrew further into his relationship with Camilla. Diana threw herself more deeply into her charitable work and her struggles with bulimia. They maintained appearances in public, smiling and waving and playing the part of a happy royal couple, but behind closed doors, they barely spoke. Then, in 1991, Diana took a step that would change everything. She began secretly cooperating with journalist Andrew Morton on a book about her life. She couldn't speak publicly about her experiences, couldn't hold a press conference and tell the world what her marriage was really like. But she could answer Morton's questions on tape, providing him with detailed information about her eating disorder, her suicide attempts, Charles's affair with Camilla, and the cold indifference of the royal family to her suffering. When Diana, Her True Story, was published in June 1992, it exploded like a bomb in the heart of the monarchy. The revelations were devastating. Diana's struggles with bulimia, her multiple suicide attempts, Charles's ongoing relationship with Camilla, all of it laid bare for the world to see. The palace initially denied that Diana had cooperated with the book, suggesting that friends had spoken without her permission. But the details were too specific, too intimate. People who knew Diana recognized her voice in every painful revelation. The book shattered the fairy tale completely. There was no going back, no way to restore the illusion that Charles and Diana were happily married. The public, which had adored Diana and given Charles the benefit of the doubt, turned decisively against the prince. How could he have treated this beloved woman so cruelly? How could the royal family have allowed her to suffer? In December 1992, just 6 months after Morton's book was published, Prime Minister John Major announced in the House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales had separated. The statement emphasized that the couple had no plans to divorce and that Diana would continue to carry out royal duties. But everyone understood what the separation really meant. The fairy tale was over. The most famous marriage in the world had failed. Diana had found her voice, and she had used it to tell a truth that the establishment desperately wanted to keep hidden. She had revealed that behind the pageantry and the protocol, behind the palaces and the tiaras, was a young woman who had been used, betrayed, and abandoned by the very institution that claimed to protect her. But she wasn't finished yet, not even close. Diana was about to wage a very public war for her reputation, her dignity, and her right to define her own story. And in doing so, she would forever change what it meant to be a member of the British royal family. The War of the Waleses. The separation of Charles and Diana in December 1992 was supposed to be a quiet, dignified arrangement. They would live apart, but they would continue to carry out their royal duties separately. They would maintain appearances for the sake of their sons and the institution. It was a very British solution, all politeness and restraint and sweeping the ugliness under the carpet. But this was the 1990s, not the 1950s. The media landscape had changed. Tabloid journalism had become more aggressive, more invasive, willing to pay enormous sums for information about the royals. And both Charles and Diana, whether they admitted it or not, were engaged in a public relations battle for the sympathy and support of the British people. In 1993, the tabloid publication of taped phone conversations revealed just how ugly things had become. First came Squidgygate, the release of a December 1989 conversation between Diana and a close friend, James Gilby. In the recording, Diana complained about the royal family and referred to life with Charles as real torture. Gilby used pet names for Diana throughout the call, including Squidgy, hence the scandal's nickname. Then came Camillagate, the publication of an even more damaging recording. This was a conversation between Charles and Camilla, also from December 1989, that was shockingly intimate. Charles spoke to Camilla with obvious love and longing. The recording contained references that were embarrassing in their sexual frankness, including Charles expressing a wish to be reincarnated as certain personal items belonging to Camilla. The conversation made it crystal clear that Charles and Camilla were having an affair and had been for some time. For Charles's reputation, the public could perhaps have forgiven an affair in an unhappy marriage, but the intimate nature of the conversation, the clear evidence that Charles loved Camilla while his wife suffered, turned many people decisively against him. Diana, who had been portrayed by some as unstable and difficult, was now seen as a victim, a woman whose husband had been unfaithful and whose suffering had been dismissed and minimized. In June 1994, Charles participated in a documentary about his life in which he admitted to adultery. When asked by interviewer Jonathan Dimbleby whether he had been faithful to Diana, Charles replied that he had been faithful until the marriage had irretrievably broken down. The admission was meant to sound reasonable, to suggest that his affair with Camilla had only begun after the marriage was already over. But the public heard it differently. Charles had admitted to adultery on national television. Any remaining sympathy for him evaporated. Diana, watching these developments, decided it was time to tell her own story more completely. On November 20th, 1995, she gave an interview to BBC's Panorama programme with journalist Martin Bashir. The interview, become one of the most watched television programmes in British history, with 23 million viewers in the UK alone and countless millions more around the world. In the interview, Diana was calm, articulate, and devastatingly honest. She spoke about her bulimia, describing it as a symptom of what was happening in her marriage. She explained that she hadn't liked herself, that she had been ashamed because she couldn't cope with the pressures. She called bulimia a secret disease, a repetitive pattern that was very destructive. She made clear that she viewed the eating disorder as a manifestation of her emotional pain, not its cause. Magnetic, she spoke about postpartum depression, about how the royal family had struggled to understand or support her. She noted that perhaps she was the first person ever to be in the royal family who had a depression or was openly tearful, and that obviously that was daunting because if people had never seen it before, they didn't know how to support it. She talked about how her struggles had given everyone a wonderful new label to apply to her. Diana was unstable, Diana was mentally unbalanced, and unfortunately, she said, that label had stuck. But the moment everyone would remember, the soundbite that would define the interview and, in many ways, define the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage, came when Diana spoke about Camilla. The interviewer asked whether Camilla Parker Bowles had been a factor in the marriage breakdown. Blind's his response was simple and devastating. She noted there were 3 people in the marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Those words, "There were 3 of us in this marriage," became instant shorthand for the entire tragedy. Diana had distilled years of pain, betrayal, and loneliness into a single sentence that everyone could understand. She had confirmed what many had suspected, that Charles had never stopped loving Camilla, that their marriage had been doomed from the start by Charles's inability to let go of his true love. Diana also spoke, more controversially, about the monarchy itself. When asked if she thought she would ever be queen, she said she would like to be a queen of people's hearts, but she didn't see herself being queen of the country. She added that she didn't think many people would want her to be queen, that the establishment she had married into had decided she was a non-starter. And most explosively, she questioned Charles's suitability to be king, wondering aloud whether he could adapt to the role, given the responsibilities it would bring. The interview was a sensation, but it was also a bridge too far for the royal family. Diana had broken the unspoken rule that royals never speak publicly about each other, never criticize the institution in public, never reveal what happens behind palace walls. She had taken her private pain and made it public, weaponizing her story in the ongoing war with Charles and the establishment. Before 1 month after the interview aired, Queen Elizabeth II took action. She sent letters to both Charles and Diana, urging them to finalize their divorce. The separation that was supposed to be indefinite would now end in a legal dissolution of the marriage. The Queen had decided that the public battle had gone on long enough, that the damage to the monarchy's reputation outweighed any benefit to keeping up appearances. The divorce negotiations took months. Diana wanted to retain her royal title and her apartment at Kensington Palace. The royal family wanted her to relinquish the style, Her Royal Highness, and any future claims to the throne. In the end, a settlement was reached. Diana would receive a lump sum of £17 million, equivalent to roughly $40 million, plus an annual allowance of £400,000 to run her office. She would keep her apartments at Kensington Palace and maintain shared custody of William and Harry. But she would lose her HRH title. She would be known simply as Diana, Princess of Wales, a small but significant demotion. Charles had insisted on removing the royal style, perhaps as a final punishment for her refusal to go quietly. The loss of the title hurt Diana deeply. It felt like a stripping away of the one thing she had gained from her years of suffering, her place in the royal family. On August 28, 1996, Diana later called that day the saddest of her life. She and Charles had wept together when they signed the final papers, sharing a moment of grief for what might have been, for the young woman and the prince who had once stood in St. Paul's Cathedral and promised to love each other forever. But tears notwithstanding, the divorce also brought Diana a measure of freedom. She was no longer bound to the institution in quite the same way. She had resigned from over 100 charities, choosing to focus her energies on just 6: Centrepoint, English National Ballet, Great Ormond Street Hospital, the Leprosy Mission, National AIDS Trust, and the Royal Marsden Hospital. She continued her work with the British Red Cross anti-personnel landmines campaign, though she was no longer listed as an official patron. Diana was entering the final year of her life, and it would prove to be the year in which she would make her greatest impact, when she would demonstrate that she had become so much more than a decorative princess. She was about to show the world what a person could accomplish when they refused to be silenced, when they used their privilege to serve those without power, and when they waged war against the forces that tried to keep suffering hidden in the shadows. A year of freedom. The year between Diana's divorce in August 1996 and her death in August 1997 was paradoxically both the most difficult and the most liberating period of her life. She was free from Charles, free from the daily reality of living in a loveless marriage. But she was also untethered, uncertain of her place in the world, struggling to define who she was beyond the title of Princess of Wales. Diana had agreed to relinquish most of her royal duties, but she retained the causes that mattered most to her. And in that final year, she would undertake the work that would become her most enduring legacy: her campaign against landmines. Landmines are among the cruelest weapons ever devised. After conflicts end, after soldiers have gone home, the mines remain, buried in the earth, waiting. They kill and maim indiscriminately, taking the legs of farmers tending their fields, the lives of children playing in what should be safe spaces. Landmines are cheap to manufacture and plant, but extraordinarily expensive and dangerous to remove. Countries that were ravaged by war decades ago are still struggling with the legacy of mines buried long before. Diana had learned about the landmine issue through her work with the British Red Cross. The statistics were staggering. Millions of mines scattered across dozens of countries, thousands of people killed or injured every year, vast swathes of agricultural land rendered unusable by the threat of hidden explosives. But statistics alone don't move hearts. Diana understood that to make people care, she needed to show them the human cost of these weapons. In January 1997, Diana traveled to Angola with the Halo Trust, an organization dedicated to removing mines and other debris of war. Angola had been ravaged by decades of civil war, and it was estimated that between 9 and 15 million landmines were scattered across the country. The statistics Diana had read before the trip showed that Angola had the highest percentage of amputees anywhere in the world, with 1 person in every 333 having lost a limb, most through landmine explosions. But reading numbers hadn't prepared her for the reality. Diana visited hospitals where she met landmine survivors, people who had lost legs, arms, eyes, their livelihoods, and their futures to these hidden killers. She met children who would never run again, farmers who could never return to their fields. She heard their stories, held their hands, looked into their eyes, and she wept for them. Moment that would define her campaign. Diana agreed to walk through a recently cleared minefield, wearing a protective visor and bulletproof vest. The images were stark and powerful. Diana, elegant even in protective gear, walking carefully along a cleared path through the red earth, mines marked with skulls and crossbones visible on either side. She was literally putting herself in danger to draw attention to the cause, demonstrating with her actions that these weapons were an urgent threat that demanded immediate action. When she symbolically detonated one of the cleared mines, watching it explode in a controlled manner, she remarked that it was 1 mine down, but there were 17 million to go in Angola alone. The work seemed overwhelming, but Diana was determined to shine a spotlight on it, to make landmines an issue that world leaders could no longer ignore. Her visit to Angola generated massive international media coverage. Suddenly, landmines were front-page news. Politicians and activists who had been working on the issue for years without much public attention found themselves with a powerful new ally. Diana gave speeches in Washington, D.C. and at the Royal Geographical Society in London, advocating for a comprehensive ban on anti-personnel mines. Some criticized her for what they called naive political activism. They argued that landmines had legitimate military uses, that banning them would disadvantage armies in conflict. But Diana was unmoved by such arguments. She had seen the human cost, and she believed that no military advantage could justify the decades of suffering these weapons caused to civilian populations. Bangkok, 1997, Diana traveled to South Africa, where she met with President Nelson Mandela. Mandela praised her work on landmines, noting that her visit to Angola had helped motivate South Africa to destroy its own stockpile of mines. He also lauded her AIDS activism, saying he had seen her sitting on the beds of AIDS patients and shaking their hands, and that her actions had changed perceptions dramatically. The meeting between Diana and Mandela was a meeting of two people who understood the power of moral witness, of using one's platform to challenge injustice and stigma. Mandela recognized in Diana a kindred spirit, someone willing to use her celebrity to effect real change in the world. But Diana's personal life remained complicated. After her divorce, she had dated several men, including Pakistani heart surgeon Hasnat Khan, whom she reportedly loved deeply. But those relationships had struggled under the weight of media scrutiny and the impossible demands of dating one of the most famous women in the world. In the summer of 1997, Diana began a relationship with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian businessman Mohammed al-Fayed. They had met at a party, and Dodi had invited Diana and her sons to vacation on his father's yacht in the Mediterranean. The relationship developed quickly, and the media became obsessed with them, photographing their every move, speculating about whether Dodi might propose marriage. Diana seemed happy in the photographs from that summer. She was laughing, relaxed, apparently enjoying the attention and the romance. Some of her friends later questioned whether the relationship was as serious as the media made it out to be, suggesting that Diana was enjoying the fantasy of new love, but wasn't necessarily planning a future with Dodi. But whatever the depth of her feelings, the relationship gave her something she had been missing since her divorce: companionship, attention, the sense that someone wanted to be with her. On August 30th, 1997, Diana and Dodi arrived in Paris after spending time on the Mediterranean. They stayed at the Ritz Hotel, owned by Dodi's father, and went out for dinner. The paparazzi, as always, followed their every move. The next day, Diana was scheduled to return to London, where she would be reunited with William and Harry, who were returning from Balmoral with their father. She spoke to her sons on the phone that evening, one last conversation before she would see them the next day. The call was unremarkable, the kind of brief check-in that parents and children have when separated. William and Harry had no idea it would be the last time they would hear their mother's voice. That night, as Diana and Dodi prepared to leave the Ritz and return to Dodi's apartment, they knew the paparazzi were waiting. They decided to use a decoy vehicle and to have Henri Paul, the hotel's deputy head of security, drive them in a rented Mercedes. It was a plan to evade the photographers, to get a few hours of privacy. No one could have known that this decision, this attempt to escape the relentless attention that had defined Diana's life since she was 19 years old, would lead directly to her death. The 13th pillar. The Mercedes was black, sleek, armored, rented from the Étoile Limousine Company. It was the kind of vehicle that wealthy people used when they wanted to move through Paris unnoticed, heavy and secure, and meant to protect its passengers. But a car that heavy is not meant for weaving through traffic at high speeds. It's not meant to be driven by someone who has been drinking. Henri Paul took the wheel. Diana and Dodi settled into the back seat. Diana's bodyguard, Trevor Rhys-Jones, sat in the front passenger seat. Critically, fatefully, Neither Diana nor Dodie fastened their seatbelts. Perhaps they thought the journey was too short to bother. Perhaps they wanted to be able to move quickly when they arrived at their destination. Whatever the reason, that decision would prove fatal. Glazed, cozy vehicles left from the main entrance of the Ritz, drawing the waiting paparazzi away. Henri Paul drove the Mercedes out the back entrance, and for a moment, the plan seemed to be working. But the photographers quickly realized the deception, and the chase began. Henri Paul accelerated. The Mercedes sped along the Seine, heading toward Dodie's apartment near the Champs-Élysées. The speedometer climbed higher and higher. Behind them, motorcycles and cars followed, photographers jockeying for position, desperate for the shot that would make their fortune. At approximately 12:23 a.m. on August 31, 1997, the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The tunnel is 660 feet long, brightly lit, its white tile walls reflecting the glow of neon bulbs. The approach is deceptive, dangerous at high speed. The road curves slightly right, then left, then there's a sudden dip. Henri Paul was driving far too fast. Later investigations would reveal that his blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal French limit. He was also under the influence of prescription medications that should never have been combined with alcohol. But in that moment, as the Mercedes entered the tunnel, no one in the car knew that their driver was impaired. They only knew they were going very fast, and the walls of the tunnel were rushing past in a blur. Then, suddenly, Henri Paul lost control. The car swerved. It clipped another vehicle, then struck the 13th concrete pillar that divided the tunnel. The impact was devastating. The Mercedes spun, struck the right wall, spun again. When the car finally came to rest, it was facing the direction it had come from. The front end completely destroyed, smoke rising from the wreckage. Henri Paul and Dodie Fayed were killed instantly. Trevor Rees-Jones, wearing his seatbelt, was thrown forward but survived, though he was gravely injured. Diana was still alive but critically wounded. She had been thrown against the front seat and then to the floor. Her injuries were internal, massive, and ultimately unsurvivable. Conserve. A French doctor, Frédéric Maillet, happened to be driving through the tunnel moments after the crash. He stopped and rushed to the wreckage. When he looked inside the Mercedes, he saw what he initially thought was 4 people dead. But then he realized one person, a blonde woman in the back, was still breathing. Dr. Maillet didn't recognize Diana. In the chaos, with her face turned away and covered in dust and minor cuts, she was just another accident victim in need of help. He began to provide what assistance he could, trying to stabilize her until emergency services arrived. The call to emergency services came at 12:26 a.m., just 3 minutes after the crash. But the response was complicated by French emergency protocols, which emphasize stabilizing patients at the scene rather than rushing them to the hospital. Firefighters and paramedics arrived and began working on Diana within the tunnel. They cleared her airway, administered medication, tried to stabilize her failing cardiovascular system. All around them, as they fought to save Diana's life, photographers continued taking pictures. Some had arrived at the scene within moments of the crash. They photographed the wreckage, the rescue efforts, the dying princess. 7 photographers were taken into police custody at the scene, their film confiscated. The images of them taking photos while Diana lay dying would fuel years of anger and accusations. Police. By the time Diana was extracted from the wreckage and placed in the ambulance, precious time had passed. The ambulance, following French protocol, traveled slowly to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, stopping several times along the way to allow medics to work on Diana. They were trying to save her life, but the slow journey meant that by the time Diana reached the hospital, she had been in critical condition for over an hour and a half. At 2:06 a.m., the ambulance arrived at the hospital. Doctors immediately took Diana into surgery, performing a thoracotomy, to try to repair the massive internal damage. Her heart had been torn from its moorings by the force of the impact. She had suffered a ruptured pulmonary vein and massive intrathoracic hemorrhaging. The surgeons worked desperately, but the damage was too extensive. At approximately 4 a.m., just under 4 hours after the crash, Diana's heart stopped. The doctors massaged her heart manually, tried everything they could to restart it, but it was no use. At 4 a.m. Paris time, 3 a.m. London time, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. She was 36 years old. At 6 a.m., Dr. Alain Paget, head of the hospital's cardiology department, held a news conference to announce what the world had already begun to suspect. The British ambassador to France was present, and he spoke briefly, saying that the death of the Princess of Wales filled everyone with shock and deep grief. In London, the news was just beginning to break. The British press, waking up to what should have been a quiet Sunday morning, were confronted with the impossible. Diana, the people's princess, the most famous woman in the world, was dead, killed in a car crash in Paris, chased by the same photographers who had made her every public appearance a circus. At Balmoral Castle in Scotland, Prince Charles was awakened with the news. He had to tell his sons that their mother was dead. William was 15 years old, Harry was 12. They had last spoken to their mother just hours earlier, a normal conversation about their plans for the next day. And now, she was gone. Around the world, as morning broke and the news spread, billions of people learned that something unthinkable had happened. The fairy tale princess, the woman who had touched lepers and AIDS patients, who had walked through minefields, who had struggled so publicly with her own pain and had used that pain to connect with others, was dead. Stabilize that followed would be unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. It would reveal the depth of the connection millions of people felt to Diana, a woman most had never met, but who had somehow touched their lives. And it would force the British monarchy to confront just how profoundly Diana had changed what it meant to be royal, how much she was loved, and how devastating her loss truly was. A nation weeps. The week between Diana's death on August 31st and her funeral on September 6, 1997, was a period of collective grief unlike anything Britain or the world had experienced in the modern era. The response was immediate, visceral, and on a scale that surprised even the most experienced royal watchers. Within hours of the announcement of Diana's death, people began gathering outside Kensington Palace, her London home. They brought flowers, tens of thousands of bouquets that they laid at the palace gates. They brought cards with handwritten messages. They brought photographs of Diana, teddy bears, candles. The pile of flowers grew and grew, eventually stretching 30 feet from the palace gates, a sea of cellophane and blooms and tears. Similar scenes played out at Buckingham Palace and St. James's Palace. Anywhere associated with Diana became a pilgrimage site for mourners who needed to express their grief in a tangible way. The crowds were diverse, young and old, wealthy and working class, people of every race and nationality. Many had never been particularly interested in the royal family before, but Diana's death felt personal to them, as if they had lost someone they knew, someone they loved. The intensity of the public mourning took many by surprise. Philosophers and social critics would later analyze the phenomenon, calling it everything from a genuine expression of collective grief to a media-fueled hysteria. But for the millions who participated, the grief was real and deep. Diana had represented something to them, hope, perhaps, or compassion, or the possibility that even in a cynical world, kindness and authenticity could still matter. But while the public mourned openly, the royal family's response was notably restrained. They were at Balmoral Castle in Scotland when Diana died, and they chose to stay there rather than immediately returning to London. The flag at Buckingham Palace was not lowered to half-mast because protocol dictated that the flag only flew when the monarch was in residence and the Queen was in Scotland. The royal family made no immediate public statement beyond the brief official announcement of Diana's death. This perceived coldness, this adherence to protocol when the public was crying out for emotion and acknowledgement, created a crisis for the monarchy. The press, which had been so aggressive in pursuing Diana during her life, now turned on the royal family. Headlines asked where the Queen was, why she wasn't in London, why she wasn't acknowledging the depth of public feeling. The criticism grew more pointed as the days passed and the royal family remained in Scotland. Finally, on September 5th, the day before Diana's funeral, Queen Elizabeth II returned to London. She walked outside Buckingham Palace to view the flowers and to meet with some of the mourners. Then, in an unprecedented move, she gave a televised address to the nation. Queen spoke about Diana with people, her dedication to her sons. She acknowledged that the week had been difficult for everyone. The speech was carefully calibrated, expressing respect for Diana and sympathy for her sons, while maintaining the royal reserve that was the Queen's trademark. It was enough to calm some of the criticism, though the damage to the monarchy's reputation would take years to fully repair. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for Diana's funeral. It would not be a state funeral, which is reserved for monarchs, but rather a ceremonial royal funeral, including all the pageantry and grandeur the British know how to provide. The funeral would take place at Westminster Abbey, and the world was invited to watch. On the morning of September 6, 1997, Diana's coffin was taken from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey in a formal procession. The coffin was draped with the royal standard, with a special border that denoted other members of the royal family. On top of the coffin lay a spray of white flowers and a card that read simply, "Mummy," from William and Harry. Walking behind the coffin in the funeral procession were Prince Charles, Prince Philip, Diana's brother Earl Spencer, and Princes William and Harry. The decision to have the young princes walk publicly behind their mother's coffin had been controversial. Many felt it was too much to ask of boys so young that they should be allowed to grieve privately. But in the end, Prince Philip reportedly told them he would walk if they would walk, offering his support and solidarity. And Harry, aged 15 and 12, walking with heads bowed behind their mother's coffin, became some of the most heartbreaking and iconic images of the century. You could see their grief etched on their young faces, could sense the enormous weight of expectation and loss bearing down on them. Harry would later say that he doesn't have many clear memories of that day, that it felt like an out-of-body experience, like watching himself from outside his own body. Inside Westminster Abbey, 2,000 guests had gathered. Representatives from Diana's charities were there, alongside celebrities, politicians, and members of royal families from around the world. Hillary Clinton, then First Lady of the United States, attended, as did representatives from over 60 countries. But the funeral was also broadcast on enormous screens set up outside the Abbey and in Hyde Park, where hundreds of thousands of people stood to watch. The service was traditional in many ways, with readings from Diana's sisters and prayers led by clergy. But it was also uniquely Diana's. The music reflected her love of the arts. The readings were personal and emotional. And then came the moment everyone would remember. Elton John, one of Diana's close friends, sang a version of his song "Candle in the Wind," with lyrics rewritten specifically for Diana by Bernie Taupin. The original song had been about Marilyn Monroe, another tragic figure who had died too young under mysterious circumstances. The new lyrics spoke directly to Diana, calling her England's Rose and lamenting that her candle had burned out long before her legend ever would. Elton John's voice wavered with emotion as he sang. There wasn't a dry eye in the Abbey. When the song was released as a single, it would become the best-selling single of all time, with sales exceeding 33 million copies worldwide, a testament to the depth of feeling Diana had inspired. Then Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, delivered the eulogy. It was a speech that would be remembered for years, both for its eloquence and for its pointed criticism of the very institutions Diana had served. Spencer spoke of his sister's qualities, her compassion, her insecurity, her desire to do good in the world. He praised her work with AIDS patients and landmine victims. He promised that he and Diana's family would ensure that William and Harry's souls were not simply immersed in duty and tradition, but that they would experience the imaginative and loving care their mother would have provided. And then, most controversially, Spencer directly criticized the media that had pursued Diana relentlessly. He called his sister the most hunted person of the modern age, suggested that the press had blood on its hands. He also made a subtle but unmistakable criticism of the royal family, implying that they had not valued Diana as they should have, that they had tried to strip away her identity and make her into something she was not. The speech earned applause inside Westminster Abbey, a highly unusual breach of protocol. The applause started with the crowds outside, watching on screens, and then spread inside the Abbey itself, a spontaneous eruption of feeling that spoke to the public's anger at how Diana had been treated. Jumhurbash Do, Diana's coffin was taken to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, where she was buried on an island in the middle of an ornamental lake. The private burial was attended only by close family. Diana's final resting place was peaceful, removed from the world that had scrutinized her every move for 16 years. The funeral was watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide, making it one of the most watched television events in history. In the UK alone, 31 million people watched, representing over half the population. The scale of the audience spoke to Diana's impact, to the way she had transcended national boundaries and become a truly global figure. In the days and weeks that followed, researchers would document the impact of Diana's death on public health. Suicide rates in England and Wales increased by 17% in the month following her death, with the greatest increase among women aged 25 to 44, those most similar to Diana demographically. Surveys found that half of Britons and over a quarter of Americans felt deeply affected by her death, as if someone they personally knew had died. Diana's death became a cultural touchstone, a moment when the world stopped and mourned together. It revealed how deeply she had connected with ordinary people, how her vulnerability and compassion had made her beloved in a way that few public figures ever achieve. And it demonstrated that while she may have failed to become queen in the traditional sense, she had succeeded in her stated ambition to be a queen in people's hearts. The people's princess, forever. In the years following Diana's death, the full scope of her legacy became clear. She had been more than a beautiful princess, more than a tabloid sensation, more than a troubled woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. She had been a force for change, someone who used her position and her pain to make the world a better place in measurable, lasting ways. Kazakhstan de-AIDS activism cannot be overstated. By touching patients without gloves, by sitting on their beds and holding their hands, she helped break down the stigma that had turned HIV/AIDS into a disease that isolated its victims from society. Her work encouraged others to be tested, to seek treatment, to not hide their diagnosis in shame. Organizations working on AIDS issues saw a dramatic increase in public support and funding following Diana's involvement. People who had been inspired by her example came forward to volunteer, to donate, to engage with an issue they might otherwise have ignored. Prince William and Prince Harry have carried on their mother's work in this area. Both have spoken publicly about the need to destigmatize HIV/AIDS, to treat it as the manageable chronic condition it has become, rather than the death sentence it once was. In 2016, Prince Harry attended a conference where he stated that stigma and discrimination still acted as the greatest barrier to defeating the disease once and for all, echoing the message his mother had championed decades earlier. Diana's landmine campaign achieved concrete results even more quickly. Just months after her death, in December 1997, 122 nations signed the Ottawa Treaty, officially known as the Mine Ban Treaty, which prohibited the use, stockpiling, production, and transfer of anti-personnel landmines. The treaty required signatory nations to destroy their stockpiles and to assist in clearing mines from contaminated areas. King Diana didn't live to see the treaty signed, but her advocacy in the final months of her life had been crucial to building the political will necessary to achieve it. James Cowan, CEO of the Halo Trust, the organization Diana had worked with in Angola, credited Diana with the treaty's success. He noted that her willingness to walk through that minefield, to put a famous face to the issue, had elevated landmines from an obscure policy debate to a front-page humanitarian crisis. The Halo Trust has since removed over 92,000 landmines, 800 minefields, and 162,000 shells, bombs, and missiles from Angola alone. Worldwide, the treaty has led to the destruction of millions of stockpiled mines and the clearance of thousands of square kilometers of contaminated land. Lives have been saved, farmland has been reclaimed, children can play in fields that were once deadly. Diana's impact is measurable in lives not lost, limbs not blown apart, futures not destroyed. Prince Harry has taken up his mother's work on landmines as well, becoming a patron of the Halo Trust and continuing Diana's mission to create a mine-free world. In 2019, Harry walked through a cleared minefield in Angola, retracing his mother's footsteps, demonstrating that her legacy lives on in the next generation. Diana's work with homeless youth through Centrepoint also continues to bear fruit. Prince William became patron of Centrepoint in 2005, personally engaging with the charity in a way that clearly reflects his mother's influence. He has slept rough to raise awareness about homelessness, visited Centrepoint facilities to spend time with the young people the charity serves, and spoken publicly about the need to address youth homelessness as an urgent social issue. Pornography, Diana transformed the very nature of what it meant to be royal. Before Diana, the royal family maintained a studied distance from the public, presenting themselves as figures to be admired and respected, but not really known. Royal engagements were formal affairs, with carefully choreographed moments and no room for genuine spontaneity or emotion. Diana changed all of that. She was warm where the institution was cold, emotional where it was reserved, willing to show vulnerability where it demanded perfection. She hugged people, she cried with them, she listened to their stories and let them see that their pain moved her. She didn't just cut ribbons and wave from balconies. She engaged, she connected, she made people feel seen and valued. This emotional approach to royal duty was initially seen by many within the palace as inappropriate, as too much, as breaking the rules that had served a monarchy for centuries. But the public loved it. They responded to Diana's authenticity, to her willingness to be human in public, and gradually the rest of the royal family had to adapt. The modern royals, particularly William and Kate, and to some extent even Charles as king, have adopted a more approachable style that owes much to Diana's example. They engage with mental health issues, they talk about their own struggles and emotions, they emphasize their charitable work in a way that goes beyond simple patronage. This evolution in the monarchy's public presentation is Diana's legacy as much as any specific charitable cause. Diana also changed the conversation about mental health, eating disorders, and the toll that public life and unhappy marriages can take on a person's well-being. By speaking openly about her bulimia and depression, by refusing to let those struggles be hidden away as shameful secrets, she helped normalize conversations about mental health in a way that few public figures had done before. When Diana revealed her eating disorder in Andrew Morton's book and in her Panorama interview, there was a measurable increase in people seeking help for similar issues. The so-called Diana effect, saw more people coming forward to be treated for bulimia, encouraged by her example to acknowledge their struggles rather than suffering in silence. Her willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that she had problems, gave permission to countless others to do the same. Prince William and Prince Harry have both spoken about the impact of their mother's death on their own mental health, and about the importance of seeking help and talking openly about psychological struggles. Their work through the Heads Together campaign and other mental health initiatives clearly stems from watching their mother grapple with her own demons, and from understanding that mental health issues can affect anyone, regardless of wealth, status, or privilege. But perhaps Diana's most important legacy is simply this: she showed that compassion matters, that one person can make a difference, and that privilege comes with a responsibility to serve those who have less. She could have lived a comfortable life, attending galas and cutting ribbons and enjoying the perks of her position. Instead, she chose to engage with the difficult issues, to visit the places where suffering was most acute, to use her voice to advocate for those who had no voice of their own. Diana was not perfect. She made mistakes. She could be manipulative. She struggled with her own demons throughout her life. She was a complex person, not the saint some have tried to make her, nor the unstable figure her critics sometimes portrayed. She was human, with all the flaws and strengths that come with that. But in her imperfection, in her willingness to be vulnerable and real, she connected with people in a way that few public figures ever achieve. She showed that royalty didn't have to mean remoteness, that privilege could be used for good, and that even someone born into extraordinary circumstances could choose to live a life defined by service and compassion. Epilogue. Her light still shines. On a small island in the middle of an ornamental lake at Althorpe House, surrounded by ancient trees and watched over by the Spencer family who loved her first, Diana rests. Visitors cannot reach the island, cannot leave flowers on her grave. It is peaceful, private, removed from the world that was so obsessed with her in life. But Diana's absence from the world is still felt, more than 2 decades after her death. Not just in the work that continues in her name, though that is significant. Not just in the sons who carry on her legacy, though they do so with dedication and grace. Diana's absence is felt in the very air, in the loss of what might have been had she lived. Imagine Diana at 60, a grandmother now, William and Kate's children running to greet her. Imagine her continuing her humanitarian work, perhaps focusing on new causes, bringing her star power to bear on whatever issues moved her. Imagine her joy at seeing her sons happy, at watching them make their own choices about what kind of royals they wanted to be. Imagine a world where she got to grow old, to see her influence shape not just one generation but 2 or 3. Imagine the lives that might have been saved by the continued force of her advocacy, the stigmas that might have been shattered by her refusal to accept that any suffering was inevitable, or any group of people unworthy of compassion. We lost all of that potential when Diana died at 36. We lost the decades of work she might have done, the evolution she might have undergone as a person and as a public figure. We lost the healing that time might have brought to her relationship with the royal family, the wisdom she might have gained, the peace she might have found. But what we did not lose, what could never be taken away, was the change Diana had already wrought in the world. The stigma around AIDS had been broken. The landmine treaty had been set in motion. A generation of young people had seen someone use their privilege to serve rather than to simply enjoy wealth and status. The monarchy had been humanized, forced to evolve or risk becoming completely irrelevant. Diana showed us that vulnerability can be strength, that admitting pain doesn't make you weak, that reaching out to touch those society deems untouchable is perhaps the most noble thing a person can do. She demonstrated that the rules that seem immutable, the walls that seem unbreakable, can be challenged by someone with enough courage and compassion. The 13th pillar in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel has been removed, replaced during a renovation of the tunnel some years after Diana's death. The physical structure that ended her life no longer exists, but the emotional and symbolic pillar she erected during her too short life stands firm. It is built of the lives she touched, the causes she championed, the example she set. Today, when we see a royal interact warmly with the public, when we see them speak openly about mental health or advocate for marginalized communities, we are seeing Diana's influence. When someone decides to volunteer with homeless youth, or to donate to AIDS research, or to support landmine clearance, because they remember a princess who showed them that such work mattered, that is Diana's legacy. The People's Princess earned that title not through birth or marriage, but through the choices she made, the courage she showed, the compassion she demonstrated. She remains beloved not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Because in her struggles and triumphs, her pain and joy, her failures and successes, we saw ourselves reflected. Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a tunnel in Paris on a summer night in 1997. But the light she brought into the world continues to shine, illuminating paths toward kindness, acceptance, and service that future generations will walk long after those who knew her name are gone. She was the fairy tale princess who showed us that fairy tales can be lies, but also that even in the midst of those lies, real magic can emerge. She was the woman who refused to be silenced, who turned her pain into purpose, and who proved that one life, lived with authenticity and compassion, can change the world. Clang the tunnel took her life, but it could not, and will never, take her legacy. Rest in peace, Diana, the People's Princess, forever loved, forever missed, forever remembered.